Yeah, sipping on Good morning, everyone. I want to start by addressing the tragic death of George Floyd in Minnesota. The reactions and justifiable outrage is sparked across the nation. I also want to remind everyone of the role each of us has to play in making our nation better and truly equitable for every American, regardless of their skin color, religion, sexuality, job, where they were born, or their political views. Mr. Floyd's death is a heartbreaking tragedy and a painful reminder that if you believe, as do I, that everyone is created equal in the eyes of God and according to the founding principles of our nation, we have much more work to do to be a better country and better people. My heart goes out to his family and the Minneapolis community, which is suffering deeply right now. And further, my heart goes out to all people of color across the nation who, even though they live in different communities, carry this trauma every time something like this happens. As you know, last week I joined the Vermont State Police to condemn the actions of the officers involved. Mr. Floyd's death under their watch, under an officer's knee, is barbaric and totally inexcusable. It's my belief they should all be charged and tried for murder and held fully accountable, both the 3 officers who used force and the officer who stood by and allowed it to occur. In the greatest country in the world, no one should stand for this. No one should make excuses for this, and no one should ignore this. We must all make clear enough is enough. And while we're watching the response across the country, it's important to reflect on a quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, who said, "A riot is the language of the unheard." They simply don't know what else to do. And for those who see the national protests and feel disdain instead of sympathy, just know the reactions we're seeing in cities around the country are the results of decades, actually centuries, of calls for help that went unheard. For many people today, every time something like this happens, it's another reminder of how long communities of color have been waiting for equity and how little things have changed. It's clear the fear, sadness, helplessness, and frustration has reached the boiling point, as the African American community has seen far too much of this. And many Americans are standing with them, as we should, because again, enough is enough. I know many Vermonters are seeking to have their voices heard as well, and I respect those who are doing so. I only ask is you do so peacefully and safely, especially considering the public health crisis we're facing. But I assure you, we're listening. I hear what you have to say, and I know we not only need to continue to hear it, but we also need to act. The fact is, hate, ignorance, and the inequality we've seen is a far greater risk to the long-term health of our nation than even COVID-19. That's why we cannot continue to treat racism and examples like the one in Minneapolis like an uncomfortable and rare event, because it's not an isolated incident. And we need to acknowledge it's systemic, and it's built upon our and into our social systems, our economic systems, and everything in between. We must also remember we're not immune to this in Vermont, which is why we've been working on a racial equity task force in recent months and will be launched today. This task force will be charged with looking at the disparities of COVID-19 infection and death rates so we can figure out how to close that gap. They'll also evaluate what supports we have for racially diverse population and whether it's enough. They will review current state and federal law on hate speech and contemplate ways to encourage Vermonters from a range of racial and ethnic groups to run and serve in public office at all levels. And we'll have updates next week when the appointments are made and as this work gets moving. But let's be honest, a task force is not the cure-all for what ails us. It's going to take some soul-searching and real change individually to make a difference. We should take this time to reflect on what role each of us can play to end hate, racism, and bigotry. And for those of us who are white, who aren't typically the victim of it, we need to take a very close look, because the reality is it's everywhere, even here. The good news is we can fix this without waiting for a vaccine or other solutions out of our control. It just takes us uniting to make this a better country for everyone, because like the coronavirus, this is literally in our hands. While we do this, we also have to address the health and economic crisis of COVID-19. And as such, I want to share some updates on this front as well. As I said last week, the Department of Motor Vehicles has been working to determine how to safely administer driver's permits and license tests. And DMV Commissioner Manoli will outline what we're doing after my remarks. Dr. Levine will also provide an update on the cases identified in Winooski last week. And later on this week, I'll be detailing additional reopenings, which, if everything continues to move in the right direction, will include steps to allow for indoor dining at restaurants soon. And I hope to have an update on how we can continue to ramp up our hospitality industry in the weeks ahead. With that, I'll now turn over to Commissioner Manoli for an update.
Good morning, and thank you, Governor, for this opportunity to speak about the DMV's Restart Plan. First, I would like to let you all know that we at DMV understand how hard the suspension of these services has been. We process more than 1 million transactions every year, and we serve more than 500,000 Vermonters. We know that you rely on us for your vehicle registration, for your driver's license renewals, for your test, and many other services. We also know that there are a lot of young people right now who have had many exciting opportunities and important activities taken away because of COVID. That includes learner permits and driver license tests. I grew up in Montpelier, and I remember very clearly the excitement I felt when I had the opportunity to head to that big, beautiful building at 120 State Street to take my road test. For teens, getting a driver's license is a milestone, a rite of passage, and a newfound freedom and independence. I know how disappointing it has been for those of you who have had to wait to take your test and to get your license. And in this very difficult time with COVID affecting our lives in many different ways, I also know how hard it's been for families not to have another driver helping with everything from errands to checking on elderly or sick relatives, or having the opportunity to begin driving yourself to your first summer job. The DMV Restart Plan outlines a phased reopening that will allow us to resume offering most driver license services while ensuring the safety of our employees and customers. Starting today, Vermonters can take their learner's permit test online at the DMV website, dmv.vermont.gov. Those who pass will receive their learner's permit in the mail. This new online test is for standard learner permits only and does not include motorcycle or commercial vehicles. You will be issued a non-photo learner permit through the mail. The next good news is that DMV will resume offering driver license examinations 1 week from today, next Monday, June 8th. Starting today, customers who were scheduled a driving exam or commercial vehicle exam before COVID and then had it canceled during the March and April will be contacted by DMV to reschedule their test. Rescheduling these individuals is our first priority. And beginning this Wednesday, June 3rd, customers who did not have a previously scheduled appointment may schedule their road test. To schedule exams, you need to call 828-2000. All exams are by appointment only. There will be no walk-ins. Please wait until June 3rd to try to schedule your exam if you were not in the previously group of individuals. In order to move through the backlog of canceled driver license road tests more efficiently and to support the needs, we are expanding testing to include third-party examiners. Certified driving education instructors who are employed or contracted by a driving school may act as agents of the DMV and be appointed as examiners to administer road tests for the issuance of standard operator and junior operator licenses. In partnership with the Vermont Driver Traffic Safety Education Association, our first training for these individuals, new examiners, will be held this Thursday, June 4th. Students who pass the exam will be issued a temporary license for 90 days and instructed by the third-party examiner how to submit their final application with the DMV for issuance of their permanent license. In order to administer driving tests, some DMV branch offices will reopen on appointment basis only. Starting June 8th, the Montpelier DMV will be open weekdays from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. for driving exams by appointment. The South Burlington and Rutland DMV branch offices will also be open from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. for driving exams. And our commercial driver's license exams by appointment will be scheduled at the AOT District 5 location at the Ethan Allen site in Colchester, and our Rutland CDL testing location at Seaward Road in Rutland. Now I'd just like to take a moment to
And our
describe
commercial
the process
driver's
for these
license exams by
All
appointment.
in-person transactions will occur outside. Driver test applicants will check in with the examiner and then wait in their vehicle prior to the exam. This has been the past practice. The difference is we'll conduct this business outside. You used to come into the building and then wait in your vehicle. I'm requesting that applicants clean and wipe down their vehicle before the exam and leave windows open where possible to increase the airflow prior to your test. No more than 2 people may occupy a vehicle during the road exam, and both the applicant and the examiner must wear appropriate face coverings. Customers should not bring guests into the location due to the physical distancing needs. If a guest is essential, such as a parent, a caregiver, a translator, the customers will specify that when making their appointments. Those who pass the driving exam will receive a paper driver's license, which is the DMV standard procedure today, and the permanent license will be mailed to them in 10 business days. All of these details will be available on our website. Just a few other items. In addition to the licensed services, we are resuming the modified motorcycle training program statewide through the Vermont Rider Education Program, beginning Friday, June 5th. All instructors and enrolled students have been provided information on the COVID safety measures and expectations. And finally, motorcycle permits will be rolled out during what we are calling Phase 2 of our new online services for permits, and that should be accomplished by the end of June, 1st of July. But in addition to this service, we are also processing alternative model to do in-person motorcycle testing, and more information will come in the next couple of weeks on that, as well as evaluating an alternative location to conduct CDL permits. So in closing, on behalf of the staff at the DMV, I want to express to all Vermonters our sincerest hope that this first phase of the DMV Restart Plan will enable you to resume getting the services that have been on hold in a manner that is safe for the DMV employees and for the customers. And we really do look forward to seeing new drivers on the road. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm happy to announce that overall, our data still reflects a very low number of new cases over the past several days, no new deaths, a very low test positivity rate, and we remain on track to enter CDC Phase 3 this week for reopening. But as we know, there are ongoing threats to this stability that we need to be aware of and watch carefully. And I will just discuss 3 of them today. This weekend, we saw protests in Burlington and other locations in the state. They were peaceful and respectful. Many have noted that the participants were by and large wearing masks, which we applaud. But of course, we are concerned about the size of the gatherings and the lack of social distancing. As one goes about public protests and other activities of civic engagement, from a public health standpoint, the same COVID safety precautions apply as with any other gathering. Because in attempting to address the great ills in our society, systemic racism, historic injustice, trauma, mistreatment by authorities, and severe health inequities, we do not want to create a greater threat to public health by accelerating the spread of COVID. We hope and ask that protests in Vermont can be done in a way that is consistent with state guidelines to protect the health of every one of us. This week marks the return of college upperclassmen to assume leases in Burlington. The city, the University of Vermont, Champlain College, and the Health Department have worked collectively and with a lot of planning to provide the proper messaging and programming in a coordinated fashion in an effort the mayor has labeled Box It In. This provides very clear and consistent messaging about the need for quarantine, the opportunity and location of testing, the public health principles regarding mass gatherings, physical distancing, and facial coverings. These are all included in this approach, along with plenty of supports and incentives to adhere to these behaviors. And we would like to welcome these students back with open arms. Last week, I told you that the Health Department is investigating a cluster of cases in the Winooski area. This is not the first cluster of COVID-19 in Vermont, and as we've stated up here, we expect it will not be the last. The nature of this virus and any highly communicable disease is, of course, its ability to spread easily from person to person, especially in our more populated areas. This is why, to help prevent further spread in our communities, the Health Department works with the individuals and community partners, and in this instance with the city of Winooski, to provide testing, appropriate guidance, and recommendations. Anytime we learn of a cluster or an outbreak in a facility, our epidemiology teams and contact tracers work with individuals to test for the virus and conduct contact tracing to identify others at risk. This is a public health effort. It's what we do every day. Our epidemiologists, along with our Burlington local health office staff, the people who community members in Chittenden County see for WIC visits, immunizations, and our local health services, are leading our outreach, contact tracing, and testing efforts. Starting today and running all week in partnership with Community Health Centers of Burlington, we are offering testing at the O'Brien Community Center in Winooski for members of the community of Winooski. Testing is free and at all of our pop-up sites. As we have learned, COVID-19 affects everyone. Whether you have COVID-19 or not, everyone in Vermont should continue to practice physical distancing, use facial coverings when in the presence of others, regularly wash your hands, and stay home if you're sick. Thank you.
And with that, we'll open up to questions.
Calvin?
Thank you. So, Governor, this might be a question for you or maybe Susanna Davis, who's on the phone, but
earlier this year, a panel of lawyers, educators, and people in law enforcement pitched sweeping recommendations of how to increase racial equity and address the problems that we have in Vermont's system. I guess a big part of that talked about white supremacy and how prevalent it is in Vermont, but also all across the nation. I guess maybe if you could just kind of address how the concept of white supremacy plays into what we're talking about today, and how I guess that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, racism, bigotry affect all of us, and certainly in the those communities that I mentioned earlier. This is not going to be something that we can fix overnight. We didn't get here overnight. We can't fix it overnight. But it's up to each and every one of us to call it out when we see it and not adhere to it. So, again, we need to address this. We all need to understand that it's here in Vermont, even though we feel as though we're insulated somehow from it. It's here, and we have to call it out for what it is. I would ask Susanna if she has anything else to offer on that. Did you hear the question, Susanna?
I did. I believe the question was, what role does white supremacy play in Vermont, or how can we address it here? Am I correct?
Yes.
Okay, so I appreciate the question, because when discussions about white supremacy, white superiority, white privilege come about, it often triggers in a lot of people a sort of defensiveness. Nobody wants to be labeled a white supremacist or a racist or someone who has white privilege. And oftentimes we equate those things with other things like economic privilege. I hear a lot of folks who say, listen, I don't have white privilege because I'm not rich. And the thing about it that I always try to ask people to remember is that white privilege doesn't mean that your life isn't hard. It means that your skin color isn't one of the things making it harder. Now further, and perhaps more directly to the question of white supremacy, a lot of folks assume when we hear the term white supremacy or white supremacists that we're thinking about the more radicalized people, right? People who describe themselves or who could be described as neo-Nazis, etc. And truth be told, white supremacy and white superiority largely operate far more subtly than that. Sure, that's the trigger image, and that's really the radicalized version of it. But white supremacy is evident in all of our systems and structures. White supremacy is the reason that Roth and powder cocaine have different sentencing minimums. White supremacy is the reason that we have to have certain affirmative action policies, because the system as designed inherently disadvantaged non-white or non-wealthy people. So when we think about white supremacy, it's really important for people and people in our state to recognize that we're not talking about the overt, loud, and obvious forms of white supremacy. We're talking about all the insidious ways that it shows up in our lives. And one of the signs that I saw in the many gripping photos that I've seen from the last few days, one of the signs said, white silence equals violence. And that's something that I've heard more than a few times over the last few years. And it's really important, I think, for white people to recognize that tacit approval, or rather silence on the matter of white supremacy, only aids and furthers the systems of white supremacy that are in play. So it's not just about knowing that it's wrong, and it's not just about saying, well, at least I'm not one of them. It's really about recognizing that as long as we work to uphold an inherently unequal system, or rather, as long as we stay neutral in dismantling the inherently unequal system, we're complicit in its furthering.
And I guess just a quick follow-up. Before COVID broke out, the legislature was working on a couple bills, one of them dealing with use of deadly force by law enforcement, the other which are requiring more data collection so we can sort of see these inequities, I guess, in the criminal justice system. I guess, where do you stand on those bills when they first were pitched? And I guess, do you kind of see that being something you support going forward?
Well, again, I don't know what the status is of those bills in the legislature at this point. That's something you probably would have to talk with them about. But what I can assure you is that we take this very seriously, and I'm going to ask Commissioner Sherling to outline some of what we've done already here in our state. because we have a good track record over the last few years of trying to address this. We still have a ways to go. But again, we, as far as public safety, the Vermont State Police, have taken this very seriously and worked upon the different approaches to this systemic problem. Mr. Sherlin.
Good morning. Thanks for the question. We don't have time to go through all of the efforts that have been underway for several years in Vermont, but it really is a confluence of things. You often hear about whether it's legislation or policy development. It really starts at the hiring process. We've got to hire the right people into law enforcement. We've got to train them appropriately. We've got to have the right promotional process so that the people supervising those in law enforcement are doing it with the right decision-making in mind. They're backed up by solid policy. There is robust data in the background to inform what we're doing. We're actively working on improving our data systems now. We've been talking with the legislature about that for several months, a variety of modernization efforts. And then most importantly, it is about engaging the community, because in law enforcement, we don't have all the answers. And in reality, we are just a reflection of the community's current standard on how laws should be enforced. We're just one part of the equation. Community safety really flows from communities being engaged, and law enforcement operations just being one piece of that and being an extension of what the community wants to happen there. Take this opportunity also to say that law enforcement and policing is about service. So we need to be ensuring that we're hiring, training, and continuing to employ those who have a service-oriented mentality, folks who are really looking at the community as partners, as ensuring that they're treating everyone they come in contact with, hundreds of thousands of encounters a year in Vermont, with dignity and respect. And if you're in this job, it's a message directly to police officers in Vermont and beyond, if you're in this job for any other reason than community service, with empathy, and to provide the requisite level of protection to those who need it, you should be looking elsewhere. We are past the point where this is something we should be discussing. If you're not in this for a service orientation and to protect the dignity and respect of all the people you come into contact with, regardless of what they have been accused of or what their circumstance is, what their race, gender, ethnic background, religion is, look elsewhere. It's time to move on. And that goes beyond just Vermont's borders. Thank you.
Stuart?
Thank you. Just since you've been here, the President was quoted on a call with the nation's governors. I don't know if we're on that call or not. But he quoted as saying,
Yeah, I think it's on right now. It started at 11, so
oh, okay, so you aren't on it.
obviously it's been here.
Quote, you have to dominate. If you don't dominate, you're wasting your time. They're going to run over you. This is to the governors. You're going to look like a bunch of jerks. You have to dominate. End quote, President Trump. What's your reaction to that?
Well, again, it's unfortunate to use those choice of words. We take a different approach. Obviously, public safety is important, highest priority of any government. Certainly here in Vermont, I talk about that a lot. But there's different ways to provide that, and it's not just for a select few, it's for all, regardless of your race and your preferences. So we take a different approach here. What happened here in Vermont, again with the protests on Saturday night, for instance, I thought everyone conducted themselves well. Obviously, it was a tense situation for many, but in the end, listening to people who are frustrated is half the battle, and then not just listening, hear them, do something about it. And again, I don't think the president's words are reflective of reality. I believe that we should be leading by example. And obviously, if there are some situations where you have to use more force, but this wasn't one of them for us here in Vermont over the weekend.
Some people would suggest you should speak to the nation. Do you think that would help or hurt?
I'm sorry, that he should? Well, maybe not with that attitude.
Could I ask Dr. Levine to clarify one thing about the Winooski cluster? Dr. Levine, you said on Friday that it was fewer than 5. We have had a net of +8 since Friday. Can you tell me how big is the Winooski cluster at this point, and what should we read into you having testing all week in Winooski? Do you think it's substantially larger than that?
Yeah, so the cluster is 7. They don't all get reported out together because different members get tested at different times. So they're all included in our updates over the last number of days, but not at one fell swoop. And the testing that we're providing on a larger basis is really an extension of what we're doing statewide. But clearly, when you found a cluster, it's best to make it convenient at the moment, and that's why we're gearing up there. Through the contact tracing process, we know exactly how to assess how big this could or could not be. If we thought this was very, very large, we would obviously be alerting everyone.
Steve?
I'm good.
All right, we're going to move to the phones, starting with Liam from VPR.
Hi, I just wanted to go back a little bit to the question around police training. We've seen several high-profile use of force cases in places like Burlington and St. Albans in the last year, and I'm wondering, if you, Governor, looking at cases like that, see a need to re-examine and change the training and curriculum that are being done for police just across the state.
Well, again, this is evolving. We have put into place the fair and impartial police training, and we need to continue to do that. And we're learning as we go. I'll let Commissioner Sherling answer to that, but it's obvious, as he said before. We need to make sure that we have people who are in this for the right reasons. They're public servants, and from there, we need to make sure that we're protecting everyone, not just a select few. So I'll let Commissioner Sherling answer further.
Thanks for the follow-up, Liam. I do think that by and large in Vermont, the training environment has evolved and is a good one. The staff at the Police Academy do a very good job, and we're engaged with a variety of partners in, as the Governor said, in fair and impartial policing and with updates to various methodologies regarding the use of force. But there is tremendous room for improvement. In the wake of COVID-19, we've had to alter a variety of the training delivery mechanisms, and that really has illuminated for us the opportunities to train differently, to train more, to deliver training using alternate methodologies, and there'll be another hard look at what it is that we're training on an ongoing basis in the wake of this event as well. So it is something that we were focused on again in that suite of modernization initiatives we were talking about earlier in the year before COVID hit, and we were accelerating some of those conversations even before the last week or so and the events that have transpired.
Are you considering changing, for example, like kind of the ratio of training to emphasize de-escalation over other sorts of force training that you might be doing?
Yes, that work has been ongoing, and I think as we continue to find ways to integrate training scenarios so that we're not training on one particular topic at a time, but we're integrating a variety of topics together in a more modern training environment, something that the University of Vermont Medical Center has been using to train doctors now for several years, an integrated training model, so you're not learning about, for example, the physiology of the heart, and then you're learning how to do cardiopulmonary resuscitation in different years. That's integrated together. We've followed sort of that same methodology in trying to blend those kinds of trainings together, and I think you'll see more of that accelerate as we begin to run even faster at our modernization efforts.
Great. And Governor, just a final follow-up for you. I believe Calvin mentioned that the legislature had proposed a bill around raising the use of force standard for police officers in the state. And I know you said you're perhaps waiting for more details on that, but broadly, could you say whether or not you support raising the use of force standard here in Vermont?
Well, yeah, again, I think as we've outlined, we are evolving as we speak, and we want to take this time to reflect on what we're doing, do it better. But I'm just not aware of the bill in particular and where it stands at this point in time. But regardless, any time that we can de-escalate a situation without the use of force, the better off we are.
Thank you.
Sean, Chester Telegraph.
Thank you. There seemed to be a large number of out-of-state cars on the road again this weekend, and we know they're being counted as they're coming into the state, but wondered if it would help to learn the scale of the problem of people coming just for the weekend and not quarantining by counting the numbers of cars that are leaving, especially on Sundays.
Yeah, we are counting both ways as far as I know, or at least we were. I'd be happy to get those details to you or provide them on Wednesday. I don't have them for this past weekend, but the weekend before, the Memorial Day weekend, it appeared it was a little bit slower leaving than coming. We typically saw that the numbers were up on Friday and then down Sunday and then Monday. So, but it took maybe 2 days, and I didn't look at the third day to see if people were going back on Tuesday. But I think I understand where you're going with this, and it's something that we do look at. But it didn't seem as though there was. It did seem like there were more staying than leaving after the Memorial Day weekend. But I don't know this weekend. But I'd be happy to take a look.
Thank you.
Colin, BT Digger.
Yeah, good morning. I had a question for Commissioner Sherling. I was wondering if Commissioner Sherling agrees with the governor's call for the prosecution of all 4 officers in Minneapolis.
Thanks for the question. Yeah, from what I've seen of the evidence, and certainly one officer's already been charged, I think there is a worthy investigation there to ascertain whether charges are warranted against the other officers. But at first glance, it looks like something that if it were happening here, we would be investigating and referring for prosecution.
Thank you. And then I have a question for Secretary Smith. Is he on the call today?
He is here.
Sorry. So, Secretary Smith, I was wondering if you could talk about, do you know sort of a general count of how many child care centers are in the state? And based on your cooperation with people, with the owners, do you have a sense of how many people are going to try to reopen this week, and any other updates on the child care reopening?
Colin, I'll have to get back to you on the number of child care centers and the number that are reopening, but I would say that there's a fairly significant number of child care centers that are reopening today, actually, on June 1st. So I'll get back to you, Colin, on the exact numbers.
And have you heard a lot of, as far as the guidelines that you've put out? I mean, our owners, we've heard a lot of questions coming into us about sort of whether opening child care is really possible in a safe way. And I'm wondering, what's the sentiment you've been hearing and what's the message you've been sending?
I've been hearing a lot of praise from the division for the way that they've been administering the what are called the Restart grants, and I've also heard about the efforts that the division, the Child Development Division, has been doing in getting supplies, needed supplies. There are some gaps in some areas, but overall, they have been doing fairly well in getting these supplies to child care centers. We're always look at what we did. Let's just go back a little bit. Look at what we did. We kept child care centers operational during the time of COVID-19, even though we had shut down the system for kids. And that was, we put in a subsidized system and kept some child care centers open during that time period because, frankly, we needed them for essential workers. We're transitioning now to the way that it was, and in that transition, we're providing $6 million for this effort in order to transition. So I've heard praise to the Child Development Division for its efforts in helping them find various supplies, and secondly, for the Restart grants that they're administering. Are there bumps along the road? I'm sure there are, but the majority of things that I've heard of are praise.
Great, thank you.
Joe, Barton Chronicle.
Hello. I think this question was asked some weeks back, and I don't recall hearing an answer. But in regard to the protests, it seems one of the things that might be underlying a lot of the anger is the experience of non-white people with COVID. It appears that the rate of cases and the severity of the outcomes in much of the United States has been worse for non-white people. I am wondering whether that is the case in Vermont as far as you can tell, and if you can explain, in case it is, why that might be and what can be done to remediate it.
Yeah, that's part of the task force that we're putting together. Their first charge is to take a look at that and see what we can do about that disparity in the numbers. But I'll let Commissioner Levine talk about that.
Thanks for that question, because you've appropriately noted the disparities in the nation regarding this. If we look at the national data, African American deaths are almost 2 times greater than what would be expected by their share of the population. And for hospitalizations, 33% of those hospitalized are African American, but only 13% of the U.S. population is. When we look at our cases in Vermont, and we do have a page on our website dedicated to this, African Americans have a rate that's almost twice that of the white population. When you ask about what are the reasons for some of the disparities, I can't tell you we have specific Vermont reasons, but there are some well adhered to explanations that have been offered on a more national basis, and I'm sure that some of these do apply. Not in any special order, but first of all, discrimination that has limited access to health and to wealth in this country, an increase in exposure to virus due to a disproportionate representation in essential frontline jobs. In major metropolitan areas, a greater reliance on public transportation and the exposures that might bring. There's reasonably good data on discrimination in the healthcare setting in terms of clinical decisions that are made around specific complaints. The African American population is well known to have a higher rate of underlying conditions that are linked to more severe cases, such as obesity, diabetes, cardiovascular disease, hypertension, lung disease. Not that there's a genetic link, just that there are higher rates of these underlying conditions. There's also higher rates in many of our major metropolitan areas of poverty, which leads to a state of chronic stress, which can be a risk factor. Those are a few.
Dr. Levine, is there anything that, in Vermont at least, can be done to mitigate these conditions? Because obviously this isn't a desirable situation.
You're absolutely correct, and I think that's one of the reasons that this task force has been assembled, to really delve into that much more specifically. We've been able to learn about this with COVID, as you know. COVID began in, early to mid-March in Vermont, so it's been a pretty condensed period of time that we've even been able to assess the situation and learn about that. But obviously, we will be working hand in hand with the task force to try to get at some of those issues. I can't really give you specificity regarding any of the explanations I've given you now. Much like most of those in the rest of the nation haven't been able to either. But these are clear-cut associations that I think most are willing to make, and we need to just explore how much in Vermont one matters versus the other. And if there are other special considerations that I haven't mentioned.
Just to be clear, the task force, they won't be focusing purely on COVID, will they? I would assume that there are lessons that can be drawn for healthcare in general.
Right, you're correct, and I'll let the governor further expound on that.
Yeah, Joe, obviously the task force, we first have to prioritize, and the COVID-19 is first and foremost on everyone's mind, and then we'll evolve from there. There were a number of initiatives, but that will be a part of a wide range of things that we'll take a look at to make sure that we're answering or doing all we can to protect this group. Susanna, do you have more you can expand upon in terms of the question?
Yes, thank you, Governor. The task force is going to be looking first at COVID-19 because that's the immediate threat that we're experiencing right now as a state and as a nation and really globally. However, that's not going to be its sole focus, and it won't be the only lens through which we look at health disparities for different racial groups in Vermont. COVID-19 is one of many health disparities. Dr. Levine did a wonderful job of explaining a lot of them. And what's important for people to recognize is that the disparities that we see in times of crisis are really reflective of disparities in times of prosperity. And so a lot of the work that needs to be done to address these very acute symptoms, really, pardon the pun, is work that is inherently slow and that needs to be done at the systemic level. So that's going to include healthcare, it's going to include housing, education, employment, and all the other things that Dr. Levine touched upon in some of the underlying reasons that created the disparity in the first place.
All right, I think we'll move to the next question. Mike Donahue, the Islander.
Governor, last night the Vermont Daily released a poll of Vermont town clerks to see where they stand with the proposal to mail ballots to everybody on the checklist for the November general election, as opposed to providing ballots to people who show an interest. Out of the initial 28 responses, they were pretty much split over the middle. By my count, it looked like 14 support the Secretary of State's proposal, but at least said they only wanted active voters. 12 are opposed, and 2 were sort of down the middle and indecisive. Realizing this is somewhat preliminary, wondering what your reaction is to that poll of the town clerks.
Yeah, it'd be nice to see a broader range of those town clerks, more than just the 28th. But But again, I just want to remind everyone, I have said move forward. I've said we need to plan for this like it's going to happen. The only caveat that I had was let's wait until after the primary to determine if we need to continue to move forward or need to pull out one of the two. That's been my only caveat. Plan for the worst and hope for the best.
Okay. And Secretary Curley, I'd reached out to you last week without any luck. I was wondering if there is any relief for owners of seasonal cabins to reopen. The cabins are designed for families, many of them coming from out of state, obviously, but some in-state. They're open to, but they don't necessarily draw a lot. But most are large distances apart. It's not like a hotel where they are using an elevator. And these owners that propose rules that would keep people separate while at the lake, what steps do you hope to have in place to save these businesses, and do you favor lifting the June 15th restriction that the governor has?
Yes, thank you, Mike. I apologize. I thought Ted and you had spoken, but maybe it was a little bit different topic. Yeah, we're working closely with the industry to try to come up with what the next phase opening or turn of the spigot would be for the lodging sector, and we do recognize that we have some outliers in terms of how the operations look. So I think you can expect some information later in the week from the governor, at least acknowledging when we'll have something to roll out. But it's being worked on as we speak.
But clearly the summer is slipping away from these business owners if they're going to end up being able to pay their taxes, they say.
Yeah, I mean, I recognize this is really difficult, but again, as the governor has pointed out, we're still concerned about what's going on around us, the folks that generally come to Vermont, and we're trying to come up with a safe way to invite people to come here as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you very much.
Chris Roy, Newport Daily Express. Chris, Newport Daily Express. Okay, we're going to go to Wilson Ring at the AP.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I guess this is most for Mike Sherling, but I'd ask it of everybody, too. Outside of Chittenden County, Vermont is just not a very diverse place. And I don't know how many police departments there are in Vermont and sheriff's office that provide law enforcement services. How much of a challenge is it, do you think, to expand these things you were talking about earlier to police departments and individuals who perhaps don't have a lot of contact with people of color?
Commissioner Sherling.
It's a great question. The training curriculum goes out to all roughly 70 or so police departments around Vermont, and it's embedded in many of the ongoing trainings that occur there. But what gets missing in a place like Vermont, where diversity is on the lower end of the scale, is something called contact theory. Humans, by their very nature, tend to fear or misunderstand things they are not commonly in contact with, and that can be other people as well. So if you're not exposed to people who have different religion, different skin color, different cultural norms, there is a disadvantage, an inherent disadvantage to that. Training cannot take the place of that, but we do our best to train to try to supplement what's lost from that contact theory. And I might ask Zuzana to weigh in on that as well.
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, this is a really big one. And, in 2020, I have a really hard time. I agree with everything that Commissioner Sherling said. And also, in 2020, I just have such a hard time accepting that anyone in this state can use lack of contact with people of color as a way of saying, well, it's not my fault. I don't see any brown folks. Well, I mean, my goodness, we have contact with people from all over the world. There's really little excuse, I think, for individuals to say that, well, we don't have enough Vermonters of color here, so there's no way that I can get exposure. And I think that this is part of the individual responsibility. The governor spoke earlier about how everyone has a role to play and about how each of us is responsible for helping to advance equity. And this is one of the ways that people, members of dominant groups, particularly white people in this case, can affirmatively do something. When you look at, for example, the media to which you expose your children, the books that you buy for them, the friends that you have over for dinner, the people to whom you expose your children, how many of them are from diverse populations? What kinds of books, what kinds of protagonists are you showing your children? What kinds of movies do you watch and promote? What kind of music do you listen to? I think exposure, some of it happens because people come to us. But when we recognize that we have a responsibility to seek out that greater exposure, then it's incumbent upon us to make that effort. Especially when we think about marginalized people, it's very difficult to expect an indigenous or an Asian or an African American or Latino person to feel comfortable, being the proactive person sometimes because of the community trauma sometimes that we hold in engagements with dominant group members. So, yeah, I think it's incumbent upon everybody to just seek out more exposure. If it's not coming to you, then go to it.
Sort of a follow-up to that, or somewhat related. Mike, or again, whomever, once you get out into the hinterlands and perhaps in Vermont's more populated places as well, how open is the law enforcement community to these the things that you're describing?
First, I want to thank Susanna for giving you a much more artful description of the nuances of contact theory and its limitations. I actually can't speak to that because I haven't met all roughly 1,200 police officers in Vermont. The ones I do know are very receptive to new ways of thinking. The state police in particular, Burlington, where I came from, people were very open to learning. Especially in this arena, this is a topic of frustration for most police officers. When they see things like what happened in Minneapolis, it's incredibly frustrating. Important to note that is a minuscule level of frustration compared to the folks that have been subjected to these kinds of discrimination for centuries. Nonetheless, some version of frustration. So there's an openness to wanting new tools, to engage with communities, and to try to find ways to bridge these gaps that sometimes turn into chasms, as we've seen over the last few days.
Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Avery, WCAX.
My question is for Commissioner Manoli. So you mentioned that third-party examiner training is going to begin this Thursday. How long is that training going to take, and when can these third-party examiners start offering tests?
Thank you. Thank you for that question. So currently there are already 8 approved driving instructors who can begin issuing these tests. The Thursday, it's a 2-hour training that will take place, and then the certification process is really about us passing information back and forth and verifying that the schedule or the road exam that they'll be taking the students on meet the expectations.
Do you hope that this will address the backlog of requests that might occur?
I'm confident this will help support the backlog that we have in this partnership. If the driving educators would like to participate, so I am very confident in that.
And then last follow-up, these reopening, the restart plan, do you see some of these things becoming a permanent fixture within the Agency of Transportation?
Absolutely. As you know, we've had to experience through this ever-changing dynamics. Online services is where we are really focused. For example, the driver permit online services, moving to being able to get your motorcycle endorsement by online services. Renewing your license online was a huge accomplishment. And is really citizens are using that. So we will continue to modernize opportunities for Vermonters as we go forth.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Kat, WCAX.
Hi, my question is about pop-up testing. So we're hearing some people say they've been waiting like 2 weeks to get their COVID test results from these sites. And I know it was pitched at one point as kind of a way for Vermonters who had to leave the state to eventually shorten their quarantine period upon their return. They could wait the week, and if they were asymptomatic, go get a test and get the results and, hopefully go back to work or back to their, quote-unquote regular lives sooner. Obviously, if they're waiting a couple weeks to get their results by, postal service, that's not really helping them. So is there kind of a faster way that people could get the results from these sites?
Dr. Levine.
Thanks, Kat. 2 weeks to me would be a significant outlier because I certainly haven't been getting that, and I get complaints when they occur. The farthest along one I got was 5 days, which I would agree is still too long if you're thinking it will help you get out of quarantine. The process is that from the pop-up site, the results are then going to get triaged to a variety of labs which are in state. The result is going to occur. If the result were positive, you could bet the person would get a call within that 24-hour period. If the result were negative, it would most likely get mailed to them and would take several days extra through the mail. The times I've been hearing about very long turnaround times for labs are when select clinics or hospitals in the state do not send their labs through our normal triage process, but directly send them to commercial labs out of state, not the ones that we use as part of our testing net, but other commercial labs. And those have taken, in some cases, much longer than 5 days to come back.
So if someone goes to one of these pop-up testing sites and, they get a test and they don't hear anything, when can they assume that it's negative? Because I think some people are, rightfully so, pretty cautious about, wanting to go back out because they don't want to put anyone at risk. But of course, they'd like to go back out as soon as they can.
No, I understand that completely. So generally, within a 48-hour period, that lab test is going to be run. And if it were positive, they would begin to hear from someone. We would still obviously want them to wait to be sure that they knew they had a negative test before they made any specific decisions.
Got it. This question might be better for the governor. It's my last follow-up about kind of pop-up testing and quarantines. Any word on alleviating the quarantine? You kind of hinted at some announcements later this week about hospitality, but is there any update you can share today on that?
Yeah, no update today. We're contemplating a number of different initiatives to allow for more in-state travel and out-of-state travel. So we'll probably be talking about that towards the end of the week.
Thank you.
Collins, 7 days.
Hi, Governor. So more than half the nation's governors have already called in their National Guards, and I believe in answering a question earlier regarding the president's comments about dominating protesters, you had said there are obviously some situations where force is warranted. It sounded like you were talking about to quell these demonstrations. I was just curious what your personal threshold might be for this and whether you've had any discussions about what moves you would take in the event that demonstrations here in Vermont turned violent.
Well, obviously, when there's a lot of damage, and public safety is in question in a local community, and it overwhelms the local law enforcement and our state forces, that's when you call in the Guard. So until that point, I think it almost provokes people. I think it creates a lot of unrest, uneasiness if you see the Guard activated, and might actually provoke more violence. So we took a different approach here in Vermont. It seemed to pay off for us, but let every state deal with it the way they see fit.
Sure, and then just the second half of that question, have you had any discussions about what moves you would take in that event? Maybe short of calling in the Guard, but any discussions with some municipal leaders or things along those lines?
Yeah, obviously, we were in close contact with Mayor Weinberger over the weekend, as well as our state police, trying to make sure that we had everything in place. There were steps in place to make sure that we could protect public safety and the health and well-being of our citizens. So, we plan again as we move forward through any of these types of situations, and hope that we don't have to use any of them.
Great, and then just lastly, it sounds like you obviously were keeping tabs on the Burlington gathering, and you seem pretty pleased with how that turned out. Is that a fair characterization?
Well, yeah. I mean, I think people, it was tense, and obviously there were a lot of people for Vermont in one location. But I think everyone conducted themselves well on both sides in all ways. I think it helps when, we put out the statement on Friday with the Vermont State Police agreeing that this was unacceptable. And there was no daylight between those statements and what they were protesting. So I think that helps.
Thanks.
Tim, Vermont Business Magazine.
I have a question for Susanna Davis and also a follow-up for the governor. Ms. Davis, I'm a white man who's received the full suite of the white privilege, and rather than speaking in generalities, what would you specifically tell someone like me and many others in my situation as to what we can do to help for this situation?
Very, very good question. The short answer is there are so many things you can do, and you've just got to do something. I'm going to run down very quickly a laundry list of things that you can do and that you can encourage your other white peers, friends, and loved ones to do as well. Some of them may be more relevant to Vermont or less relevant to Vermont. Some of them you may not feel like it's your place or your ability to do so. But each one teach one, right? Everybody is going to play a role. You can do things like check in with your local law enforcement agencies, attend those meetings, ask them about the policies that they're implementing that have been proven in other jurisdictions to advance equity. Things like body-worn cameras, things like data collection and public reporting, right? Be present in those spaces. You can do things like look at whether your city, your town, your county, your state, or your federal government is employing a diverse set of people in leadership and in decision-making, right? Tokenism is one thing, that's just having more brown bodies in the room, but meaningful inclusion means that they're part of the conversation and actually being heard. You can do things like do an audit of the media in your home, especially if you have children. What kinds of movies and books, series of music are you exposing them to? Are there things that are more inclusive that you could be including in the home? Who are the people you surround yourself with, and what kind of an example in diversity do you set for your children or for other people around you? If you are an educator, if you have family or friends who are educators, share different resources with them. There are lots of things that educators can use in schools. Same things like books, etc. For children, or even like Black History flashcards or what have you. A lot of these things not only can be shared by parents with their children, but also with your teacher friends. You can make sure that you contact companies when you are noticing that their employees are engaged in inequitable treatment. Let them know how you feel. If you witness inequity happening, discrimination happening, you should say something to somebody who's in charge. Because one of the biggest ways that racial inequity gets perpetuated is through our silence and therefore our tacit approval. Contact your federal and state and local government about things like incarceration, minimum sentences, bills that you like or don't like. Defer to groups that serve people of color. Ask how you can join. Some might tell you, please join us at a protest. Some might tell you, hey, we want you to make some calls. Some might tell you, hey, can you donate? Others might say, hey, mentor a young person. So take direction from the people who are most deeply impacted. It's important that allies not center themselves in work, right? You can canvas, you can watch some really, really great documentaries and films, and perhaps you'll find a mechanism for posting some of this content online so it's centrally located. Lots of wonderful books. New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, The Case for Reparations, Between the World and Me, both are written by Ta-Nehisi Coates. 13, which is a wonderful movie about the 13th Amendment. So many things that you can do. I'll stop here. But I suppose the biggest takeaway from this is do something.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Governor, one of the things that you've suggested before that would help actually with not only people of color but also poorer Vermonters is integrating the child care system more closely or perhaps completely into the public education system, which would solve a lot of problems. As you know, the child care centers work at very, very slim margins. And as Secretary Smith has mentioned many times, the money that's had to put in just to keep them going during this time. Is this perhaps an opportunity, what is happening now, both nationally what we're seeing, but also with the COVID crisis, to take a major swing at sort of that metaphor, take a major swing at changing that entire system in Vermont?
Yeah, it's as appropriate today as it was 3 or 4 years ago when I advocated for it, the cradle-to-career approach. We see the number of students, K through 12 students, dropping every single day. We've lost thousands, tens of thousands, 30,000 in 20 years in our K through 12 system. What we should be doing is, and we're spending a lot of money to do so, to educate the remaining 73,000. So my thought, again, is to integrate as much as we can higher ed with early care and learning, and to bring the two together without spending more money, but spending the money that we have more wisely. And so I think it's an appropriate discussion to have in reflection of what we're going through today and what we're going to be going through in the future.
Is there an opportunity in the legislature? Everyone seems a little paralyzed by not only what's going on, but by the money situation. Is there an opportunity, you think, or is there just, there's the circumstances are not going to allow it?
Well, I certainly try to be optimistic about this because we have to be practical. We have to be realistic. We can't continue to tax our way through this and increase taxes on those who are still here. So my hope is, and we give a better education as well. Let's not forget that this would be better for our students, not just saving money, but giving a broader perspective to students is the most important factor here. So I'm still hopeful. We'll still advocate for it and work with the legislature to do so if they're willing.
Thank you, Governor. Thank you, Ms. Davis.
Aaron, BT Digger.
Hi. Levine discussed, the need for individuals to take responsibility when they go out protesting, like wearing a mask and trying to maintain social distancing. But I was wondering what guidance you're giving to local officials and police departments on what they need to do to allow for social distancing at these protests. it occurs to me that a lot of the basic methods people take for crowd control, like confining people to a certain area or to a certain street, could lead to overcrowding and make social distancing more complicated. Is there any guidance on how to prevent that from happening?
Commissioner Shirley.
Great question. Not specific guidance, but I know that the tack that's been taken so far is to, allow these peaceful protests to move about as necessary to ensure distancing, sort of organically. And, it also gives an opportunity for me to say one of the roles of law enforcement is to ensure that people can exercise their right to First Amendment free speech, and that's one of the reasons you see a law enforcement presence. It's only in part to ensure that there isn't anything that goes poorly. In large part, it's to ensure that there aren't people trying to interfere with the protest, to ensure that traffic doesn't interfere with people's right to speak freely, and that if necessary, that roads get shut down in order to allow those kinds of things to happen.
Any additional comments from the health department on that? Okay. The other question that I had, go ahead.
I was going to say, we partner with our colleagues in public safety all the time, so that we try to accomplish everyone's goals together in the most equitable way and least potentially harmful way.
Okay.
You had another question?
My other question was, sorry?
No, please ask your question.
My other question is that we've seen, in many of these protests elsewhere in the country, the press being silenced, harassed, even potentially attacked. I was wondering if Scott had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't get all of that, but it was about the media being attacked.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, again, that is not something that we'd see here in Vermont, and it's just not useful, not helpful at all. I mean, the media has to report what's happening. We want it done accurately, so we want to make sure that they have all the tools they need to make sure that it is promoted in a way that our citizens can contemplate and absorb. So I think making sure that we have the press there and protecting them as well. Again, I think in some situations we might have to make sure that they're protected and moved out of the way in some respects, but not to turn them away, and certainly not to take them into custody.
Thank you.
Greg, the county courier.
Hi, Governor. So you mentioned earlier that the DMV was split over restarting the driver's tests. This is obviously something that we've brought up a few times in this context. Can you give us some specifics on what some of the opposing views were and what the debates were that Vermonters aren't hearing as to either allowing or not allowing driving tests?
Yeah, it wasn't so much that there was an internal issue with DMV itself. It was just that we were trying to attract our partners as well to try and see if we could expand upon what we're doing, and that's where there was more debate, and not everyone was on the same page. I'm happy to say, and I'll ask Commissioner Manoli to expand upon it further, but I'm happy to say that everyone came together, and this is a success story. We'll be able to, I believe, and I've asked DMV to make sure they prioritize this so that we can catch up on the backlog within 30 days, so that we can take care of everyone within that 30-day period. So with our partners, with what we're doing at DMV, with different procedures and so forth, I'm confident that we'll be able to accomplish that. Commissioner Manoli?
Thank you, Governor. I think you covered it very well. And with the Driver Education Association, We are in this together. They are supporting the online driver permit testing and the third-party testing, and it will make a difference. And I really look forward to, what next week brings and how we're accommodating these services for Vermonters.
You mentioned there are already 8 third-party examiners. Were they already certified to do examinations, or was this something that you guys got up and running right off?
No, they are already certified to give exams at this time.
Okay, thank you. And follow-up for the governor. On Friday, you talked about your re-election bid. You stated in your announcement that you would not be campaigning as long as the state of emergency is in effect. But the state of emergency is something that you personally have control over starting and stopping. So this really could lead to a candidate that's running against you either in the primary or in November, accusing you of either not extending the emergency order and putting the public safety in danger in order to be able to do a debate or a campaign, or on the flip side, not extending the order in order to avoid a debate. So, what kind of measurable parameters can we expect to be looking for the end of the emergency declaration?
Yeah, let me be clear on the state of emergency. It's not the declaration, it's not the piece of paper. It's whether we are in a state of emergency or not. When we start to get whether that's still in effect or not depends on how well we're doing. And so if we're on a path to where we're getting back to normal, even if the state of emergency is still in place, I would then feel comfortable in going out to campaign. But until that time, I feel as though we're still in the state of emergency. There's a lot of things to do. It takes all of my attention to focus on that, to put things back to normal. Once we're on that path, and I feel more comfortable about where we are, and Vermonters are feeling more comfortable, regardless of whether the state of emergency is in place, is not going to determine whether I campaign or not. It really is about whether we're on that path or not.
So are we not on the path of
we're
putting
not,
everything in the right direction at the moment?
We're not. We don't have any restaurants open for in-house dining. We're still seeing an escalation of cases throughout the Northeast. When I look back this past week, I see New Hampshire had 560 new cases just last week. They had 74 deaths. Massachusetts had over 500 positive cases, or 5,300 positive cases, and they had over 1,000 deaths. And New York had 10,000 new cases, and they had 1,600 deaths. Now, here in Vermont, we had 9 positive cases, one more death this week. So in comparison, we're doing okay. But as a region, as I keep talking about, we are still, this is active in our region. So until we see those numbers start to drop off in other parts of the region, or we can get back to opening up normal, when we're back to some sense of where we were before, then I'll feel more comfortable. But today, I don't feel that we're there yet.
Thank you, Governor.
Brittany, Local 22.
Hi, my question is about the DMVs. I was just wondering if you had any idea how many people had to or have to reschedule their driver's test because of COVID, or how long it might take to get through that backlog of people?
Yeah, Commissioner Manoli.
Thank you for that question. There are approximately 2,000 different types of exams that were canceled. Over a little over 1,000 are the driving exams. Approximately 200 CDL tests and permits, and then the rest are driver learning permits. So beginning today, you can go online and start taking your permit through that method. And so that will reduce that backlog fairly quickly, and we're comfortable. Many people will use it, And then the test that we anticipate that would have normally been scheduled in May and moving into June is probably going to be around 1,000 to 1,500.
All right. Thank you so much.
Chris Mays, Brattleboro Reformer.
Hi. I was wondering if I know that the governor said that we'll be looking at out-of-state travel later, and there's still some concern in the region. But I was wondering if there's any sort of benchmark that we're going to be looking at for inviting more out-of-state visitors to Vermont.
Yeah, Commissioner Pichek had covered that on Friday, and we are refining that. So yes, there will be a benchmark, and it has to do with the number of cases per capita. So we'll go over that again on Friday and make sure that we specifically talk about what we're looking for.
All right, thank you.
Thanks. Next is Joel, Burlington Free Press.
Yeah, hi folks. I do not have a question today, but thanks for asking.
Thank you, Joel. You can come back again.
I'll do it.
All right, next we have Maria with the Washington Post. Maria, if you're there, it's *6 to unmute. All right, we'll move to Steve from maketv.
Can you hear me?
We can.
I've got questions for the governor, Mr. Sherling and Ms. Davis. Ms. Davis, you mentioned the sentence disparities for crack and powdered cocaine, and seems how we have a very large amount of people of color in our prisons who were arrested for either dealing or bringing drugs into the state of Vermont. Couldn't the governor just commute their sentences or decriminalize these drugs so that we're not targeting people of color who are taking, or taking advantage of sometimes the only way they have to make to make money?
Thanks for the question.
Go ahead, Susanna.
Thank you, Governor. I was just going to say I'll leave it to the governor to determine and to assess what's within his realm of authority. But what I would say is that you're touching on some really big systemic issues that that do speak to what kinds of reforms we need to see nationally and at the state level and at the local level, not only to do right by the people who are in the justice system, but to prevent people from getting caught up in it in the first place. You talked about things like decriminalization, and then you mentioned the narrative about folks of color coming and bringing drugs into the state. And I think that's a really big one because Vermont has been hit very hard, in particular, by the opioid epidemic. And that has, in a lot of circles, fueled this narrative that, well, it's people of color and with out-of-state plates, and they're bringing drugs into the state. But the data do not tell the same story. And so when we think about certain communities or people who are being over-policed and the downstream consequences of all of that, I think it's really important that we remember that the narrative is one thing, but the data are completely another, and that, times are changing, and things that the law saw as reprehensible in the past, attitudes have changed, and thus the law has to be able to keep up with it.
Okay, for Mr. Sherling, recently the police shootings that come to mind are like Wayne Brunette, Ken Stevens, Phil Greenon, Jesse Bishaw, and recently Nate Griffin. He was taken out by 9 policemen Ben Greg Ware. There were 12 cops that took him out. He had a BB gun. Michael Battles, there were five policemen surrounding him when he was shot to death. And in three of these, the last shootings that I mentioned, there was a Trooper Brown who was involved in these three shootings where there were killings. Is Trooper Brown still with the VSP?
Steve, I'll let Commissioner Sherling answer that, but I just want to make sure you're aware when you characterize just a BB gun, that wasn't the old Daisy Air BB gun. This was something that looked exactly like a sophisticated weapon. So I think we have to be careful when we just refer to things because reality is far from what you described.
Well, that may be true, but on the other hand, you'd mentioned the St. Albans, the problem in St. Albans with an officer up there, and involved a woman in a jail cell. When not a year prior, the same officer and one of his partners had disarmed a guy with an AR-15 who was an active shooter, and they took him out with just one shot to the leg, when they would have been justified in taking him out completely. It just seems to me we've seen a lot of shootings, and but fortunately we haven't seen many lately. But is this trooper still with the VSP, Mr. Sherling?
I don't believe so, but I have to check with Human Resources to verify employment status. I can't speak to the various events that you mentioned. I'm familiar with some of them, but certainly not all of them. And I'd simply say that there are a wide variety of circumstances that are faced day to day. Some of them, unfortunately, result in the deadly use of force. It's a relatively small number, although those events are incredibly impactful to everyone involved. And it's a complicated operating environment. So each one of those events is a complex thing, and we're constantly working to find ways to improve the outcomes of every encounter. As I mentioned earlier, hundreds of thousands of them annually.
Okay, thank you. And Governor, I realize how busy you are with this emergency declaration and all that's involved. But how hard would, in these days of video conferencing, how hard would it be really to do a video debate with any of your opponents, primary or during the general election?
Again, when this state of emergency, from my perspective, is over, I'd be happy to debate.
Okay, and I was wondering too. I mean, how can we justify not having indoor dining when we justify air travel, where people are seated next to each other, breathing recirculated air, but just by flying in regular jets?
Well, again, by the end of the week, hopefully we'll have some good news on inside dining.
Okay, and for Miss Davis too, I had
Steve,
I was a little kid.
Steve,
yes, sir.
Yeah, we'll let you ask this one last question, but we've been trying to keep everybody to one or two questions with a follow-up. But go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, all right, very briefly. Miss Davis, when I was a kid, I was watching the marches in Selma and everything, and I was fortunate to grow up near a military base where there was plenty of diversity in the schools and everything. And I remember distinctly Martin Luther King saying that although we were commanded to love one another by the good book, that we need not like one another. Are we being commanded now to like one another?
I don't think we've ever been commanded to like one another, and perhaps that's for each person to determine for himself. I think that when we talk about structural inequity, it's not really about whether you like it or like people. I don't expect everybody to like me here, and that's okay, But I do expect for people to be treated equitably. That's what we're here for. And so, and I love that you've asked this question, because a lot of times, particularly during protests, a lot of people remind us that Dr. King spoke about nonviolence, and I'm not saying you're doing that here, but I'm using this as an aside. A lot of people remind us selectively that Dr. King preached nonviolence as a way to tell people, well, okay, you're mad, but can't you just, I don't know, sing about it or something? And it's really important that we remember the way that you have, that he said a lot of other things too, right? And that we are compelled to act in the face of indifference, in the face of silence, and yeah, you may not necessarily be commanded to like one another. I don't think that's been the case. I'd prefer it, but that's not really what we're here to do, I think.
All right. Well, thank you very much, all of you.
All right, Guy Page.
Hello, Governor. Ms. Davis. This is a question, I think, for Ms. Davis, but really, Governor, you can kind of decide who's the best person to answer. All Vermonters agree about the injustice of the Floyd killing, but some are concerned that it could be used to condemn all police. For example, this weekend, Vermont Senate candidate Keisha Ram tweeted about a teenage encounter with LA police, which she wrapped up by saying, quote, "That's when I learned there is no such thing as a good officer unless something drastic changes in the culture of impunity for law enforcement." So I guess I want to ask you, is it a fair characterization to say, quote, "There is no such thing as a good officer"? And how would you advise Vermonters to view their police?
Yeah, again, I think that I have a tremendous amount of respect for law enforcement and the job that they do each and every day, putting themselves in danger for us as public servants. Having said that, not all are good cops. We've seen that, obviously. But by and large, that doesn't speak for every person who's a member of law enforcement. Again, we can't paint the law enforcement community with a broad brush, nor can we paint anybody with a broad brush. What we should do is take that individually. And in terms of law enforcement, I think that Commissioner Sherling had laid it out well in the beginning. Make sure you know what you're getting yourself into, and make sure we have the right people stepping up to provide for the safety of our citizens. Susanna, I'll let you weigh in, and then possibly Commissioner Sherling as well.
Thank you, Governor. Yeah, as a person of color, as a female, and as a young-ish person, I think that one's debatable now. As a person a member of the dreaded millennial generation, I think I've been exposed to enough and as an attorney, I think I've been exposed to enough blanket generalizations about my character to be very wary of statements that characterize all law enforcement as bad or problematic. I think that they're in a profession that is inherently dangerous and inherently fraught with conflict. And yet, as it was stated earlier, it is a profession that is predicated upon service. And so just as we owe a debt to each other to respect the laws, they owe a debt to us to enforce them in a way that's equitable. I don't think it's constructive to label all law enforcement as bad. I do think that we should understand the underlying message around those kinds of comments and recognize that people feel like the persistent and widespread nature of police brutality feels to them as if it's everyone. We know it's not, and it's our job to prove that. And I keep my personal feelings on this topic separate because the jurisdictions that I've lived in my life are very different than Vermont, and so my experiences are not necessarily reflective of what we see here.
Sure.
Thank you. Yes.
Thanks, Governor. I don't have much to add other than to say painting any group with a broad brush is kind of how we end up with these problems. You can find folks that behave inappropriately in policing, in politics, in journalism and the medical profession and the legal profession and manufacturing. You pick a place. That's the unfortunate side effect of being human, is to have flaws. I think by and large, you've got about 1 million police officers in the United States, and the overwhelming majority are in it for the right reasons, for service to community, to protect their communities, to make their communities better, and to partner with the community in every corner. But unfortunately, it's a profession that exists and always has, but exists in a fishbowl, and every event that doesn't go well is magnified as a result of being in that fishbowl, and rightfully so. It is an extension of the community enforcing laws and entrusting people to do that in a fair and equitable way. And when things go poorly, that criticism comes down in the requisite way. But by and large, I think the vast majority of police officers in the United States are in it for the right reason and doing a good job. That doesn't make front page news in most instances.
Thank you.
Well, that concludes today. Thank you very much for tuning in, and we'll see you on Wednesday.